Right, and today our speaker is Duncan Grant, and he'll tell us about the lesser known Launceston missions and churches. And Duncan is a retired senior history lecturer or teacher at St Patrick's College, Launceston, and he taught modern history and ancient Roman history and studies of religion for 25 years. He completed his honours and master degrees at the University of Cape Town with a focus on urban history. He has taught economics at the history at the University of Cape Town and history method at Rhodes University in Grahamstown while in South Africa. So Duncan now pursues history as a hobby and has a particular interest in buildings of any type and combines this with his photography. So I'll ask Duncan to come forward and present his talk. Welcome, Duncan.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. I thought you might all be out at the gorge today and watching the flood. It seems that half of Launceston are there when I came down. And thank you particularly to Marion and the committee for inviting me back. Last time I spoke, it was 2020 BP, before pandemic. So, a few things happening in between. Okay. I might actually take this off. There we go. Good, I'm getting thumbs up at the back. That's better. And I've got to get my coordination right now because I've got a button and a mic and a page to turn. Let's see how we go. Oh, it buzzes. How many of you were here for the last talk? Just I don't intend to repeat myself, but just interesting to know. So I'll just start with a quick promo, just so you know where this work is coming from. So I've, 2017, started taking photographs of churches, and that's what it was to start with, and then began to add a little bit of information to it, and it developed into this giant thing, which is still growing. I have a website, Churches of Tasmania project, and the URL is there, so you can look up any of the churches which I've done so far, which is almost 1,200. And the end is in sight. I've got 1,600 in total, and I'm also going to be doing a few select ancillary buildings such as Sunday schools and parish halls and so on. And it won't be restricted to Christian churches or Christian buildings. I'll look at synagogues, temples and mosques. There are a handful of those as well. And the idea is to create a photographic and historical record of all of the churches, and particularly the insides as well, which are not photographed very frequently. Now, if you go onto the website, let's go back, you'll find that at the top of the page. If you click onto that intro, it'll take you to a link which will take you to Google Maps. Okay, so it's probably the easiest way to find the churches. So I've mapped each one onto Google Maps, so you can search it by zooming in onto the map itself, or going down the drop-down box on the left-hand side. So we zoom into Launceston. They're colour-coded in terms of whether they still exist or being used for different purposes or disappeared. If you click onto one of those, it'll pull up a little box, and that's where we are here. The closest one still standing is the Russell Street Mission, Anglican Mission, And if you click on the link there, it'll take you to the article with the photographs. That's probably the easiest way to access it. So, although it's called Churches of Tasmania, it's more accurately Places of Worship of Tasmania. That doesn't quite sound so catchy. And why I say that is because chapels and other little places, I just found about everywhere. That's why I've got 1,600 of them, whether it's a chapel at a school or in a hospital or even in a probation station. If it was used as a place of worship, then I will cover it in one way or the other. There are 170 places of worship established in Launceston, and I'm still finding a few, of which about 50 are still being used. Okay, some of them are in shops. And they're not your traditional churches, but they are out there, and they are still opening. When I started to plan this, I was going to try and cram as many in as possible, and I decided that was going to be a lose-lose situation, so I'm going to concentrate on only 3 to 5, and we'll come to those in a minute. But I'll just flash these by you just to perhaps make you aware of a number of buildings. You may be aware of them already, which are on that 170 list. So these were newish to me, and I won't read them out to you, but you can just take the pictures in. A lot of them were not traditional churches, like the Catholic Chapel on Cameron Street. It's long gone, that predates St Joseph's. St Columba's in South Launceston, Brisbane Street, Sunday School and Union Chapel. And just some examples of non-traditional places of worship. St Vincent's Chapel in the St Vincent's Hospital. That's really interesting. If you've been, they've got a lot of material there from the old Hobart orphanage, including the window and the altar. Okay, Carmelite Monastery, talked about the Russell Street Mission, Presbyterian Church in South Launceston, Wilson Street, the Youngtown Primitive Methodist that featured today in Nigel Birch's article, and it's got the Craythorne Road Methodist Church next to it. It was dragged in. That's at the front of the picture. The Ravenswood Methodist Chapel, Salvation Army Hall, Somerdale Christian Mission, which later became the Baptist Church, which that building's removed. I've got a new brick one there. Christian Mission, I think most of you will know that one. It's quite an important building in the story of Launceston's the development of Launceston's faith. St George's Sunday School, which was originally a church, that's been painted black. Somebody's painted all the brick black. It's now a dance school, and it's quite shocking to see. It was designed by Alfred Luttrell, and I've contacted the Heritage Office, and the Alexander North Church is protected, but for some reason they didn't put that one on the list, and it's now a nice beautiful black colour. The Catholic Apostolic Church on Margaret Street. Oh, there's a few more. Galvin Street, that was in the promo. I'll say a little bit about that at the end if I have time. That came from De Lorraine, the building. The Wharf Mission, not to be confused with the Bethel Mission, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit of detail. That became Launceston City Mission's first official hall when they acquired it and moved it to Cornwall Square. And the St David's used to be called Church of the Holy Cross, Cornwall and North Riverside. Not quite sure what date they changed the name. Right, so the churches which I'm going to focus on today are lesser known ones. They're lesser known for a reason, and that's why, because poor people attended them, and they're kind of invisible, I suppose, to history. And they fall within about a 60-year period from the late 1840s through to the turn of the 20th century. And there were plenty of poor people in Launceston then, and these places of worship came and went and were quite active. Just to give you a little snap into, I suppose, thinking at the time, this is a meeting which took place in 1862, the town mission, and Reverend William Law, who was the congregational minister, spoke there. I was going to read this to you, I just find it really fascinating. He says, there was a very large proportion of inhabitants who never attended a place of worship. If we assumed the population at 10,000 souls, it was safe in saying that 4,000 of them never entered a place of worship. Okay, and I found that quite interesting. We live in an irreligious age, so apparently things haven't changed that much. He said, if the audience could imagine 4,000 heathens in all their degradation, filth and ignorance brought to live in this town, they would have an accurate idea of some of the people who lived and died here. I'm not quite sure what Reverend Law would think of Launceston today, but anyway, I won't dwell with that. Right, so the ones with the stars on, I'm going to try and deal with those today. There's a lot which fall into this category, and we'll see how far we can go with this. Right, so the first one I'm going to look at is the Bethel Chapel, which was at the end of St. John Street on the wharf. You can just see it on the next slide. There it is. There's a little thing here. If I touch it, apparently it'll highlight it. Oh, maybe not. Okay. It's next to the government, the red bit. Not the easiest way to show. There's an image of it, which I'll show you just now, thanks to Marion. She drew my attention to that. So in the 1840s, an area of concern was the Launceston's Wharf district, and it was here that Bethel Chapel was built to address the spiritual needs of visiting sailors, as well as the poor living in the area. So it was a brick chapel which was built. It was the initiative of the Christian Union, which was established in 1844, which was basically a gathering of nonconformist ministers. The building was used as not only as a chapel for sailors, but as a Sunday school and as an industrial school. And the Primitive Methodists used it as well. All sorts of people used it occasionally. It was built by public subscription in 1846 by Twining and Burton, and was the 12th place of worship in the town. And a lot of familiar names there for those who know the history of Launceston churches. John West stands out, and Henry Reed, as well as Charles Price and others. Right, so the movement to build the chapel began in 1845, and I'll just read you a little extract from the Examiner. So the concern was that the sailors coming into town weren't going to church. There were services held on the decks of vessels, but no united effort had been made to kind of get them to attend church, to leave their vessels. Poor men, they probably wanted to be left alone. But they thought if they provided a Bethel Chapel, which was seamen would feel comfortable with, then that would be a good idea, and it could be supplied by clergymen in rotation. Right, so here is the chapel. Let's see if I can get this to work. No, the clicker's not working. It's meant to be a little circle which comes up. If you look on the top right-hand side, you can see a flag with Bethel written on it. Okay, and then if you come down, you can see the entrance just below the flag, a couple of windows, and there's a building in front of it which obscures most of it. That's the only clear image we have of the building. And this is a pencil drawing taken at the departure of the Tasmanian delegates to the Australian Anti-Transportation Conference. And so it just happened to feature in that drawing, and how accurate that is, I don't know. After it opened in 1847, it proved very difficult to sustain financially, as with most of these missions. And in the short space of time, it was suffering the challenges of being on the riverfront, very much like now. In 1849, for example, an examiner reported that after the rain, the wharf invariably presents the appearance of a pigsty being covered with mud to the depth of several inches. The Bethel Chapel is surrounded by drainings from several yards, amongst which is a butcher's and is most unapproachable. In 1852, it was flooded, and there were calls for it to be removed. It was regarded as wholly untenable. So I don't think it was too successful as a chapel for sailors, but it was used as a Sunday school and as a free industrial school, and it was known as the Bethel School. So that was held in the chapel, and an association was formed, Free Industrial School Association, and a ladies' committee was established, collected subscriptions, and hopefully to use this for educating the children who lived in the wharf area. So it was done up and reopened in July 1862, and according to the examiner, it all appeared to be working well. It's been re-shingled, whitewashed and drained. It tells you something. The number of children in attendance were 70 to 80, and they were taught by a mistress and assistant, and reading, writing, arithmetic, and lectures were given by the town missionary on scriptural subjects. And there's a lady there to help with the needlework, and they collected old clothing to renovate for the children attending the school. Funding presented a challenge to the school's operation, and at the close of 1866 it was £100 in debt, and by 1869 it was barely functioning. A visitor to the school commented, "I learnt with dismay, the Christians of Launceston have in this matter at least become weary in well-doing." I just love that phrase, weary in well-doing, charity fatigue. And the excellent teachers informed me that for the last 5 months they received no aid from any source whatsoever, and that for the present they were conducting the school on a principle of faith. I can identify with that as a former teacher. Chapel was also used as a Sabbath school, and it came under the authority of the Northern Tasmanian Sunday School Union, established in 1863. And this was a separate organisation from another Sunday School Union, and its aim was to provide Sabbath services for poor children. The union built a chapel schoolroom on Brisbane Street, which opened in December 1864. So those are the two which were run by this organisation. It was also one that ran up at Sandhill, a congregational chapel. In 1868, the Sunday school, it's got to make sure I'm not out of sync with my slides. In 1868, the Sunday School Union was disbanded, and this presented a problem for both the Brisbane Street School and the Bethel Chapel. And it was proposed that the buildings might be used to accommodate ragged schools for the numerous poor children not attending public schools. And that's a whole subject on itself. In 1870, Murray Burgess, the chairman of the Board of Education in Launceston, investigated the suitability of the buildings. And this was quite a long report. It was quite an interesting one. I've just taken this bit out of it. I've examined the buildings proposed for the occupation as free or ragged schools in Launceston, and have placed myself in communication with the Reverend Mr. Price, principal promoter of these schools. I regret I cannot report favourably on either. The brick chapel on the wharf requires substantial repairs, has no yard, closets or enclosure whatsoever. The Union Chapel in Lower Brisbane Street is a wooden building in a fair state of repair, but the allotment on which it stands is surrounded by brothels. In their play hours, the children would be exposed to worse influences. So the ragged schools never came about. The chapel was the target of criminals and vandals, and it's one of the adverts put into the local press about a break-in. And I think 3 occasions in 1 month for very little return, 5 pence and coppers were stolen. And another notice is put in regarding vandalism, which took place in the same year. This comes from a police court report. And I'll just move that on. Oh, wrong. I've gone to go back. James Loftus was charged with cutting letters on the door of the Bethel Chapel. Arthur Green deposed that while in Sunday school he heard a disturbance, and going to the door he saw 4 boys outside. Among them was the defendant. He observed 3 letters of an obscene word had been cut on the door. All the boys denied having done it. James Taylor deposed to having seen the defendant cut the letters. The defendant was ordered to be imprisoned for 14 days. And when I read that, I wondered, three letters of an obscene word. Is there a 3-letter bad word, or didn't he quite finish the 4th letter? It'll remain a mystery. It was never revealed. An attempt was made to revive the chapel, and 1876, the Sunday school had finished operating by then, and so it was very short-lived. It was a lady volunteer who tried to give attention to the unruly and neglected children in the neighbourhood, but it was abandoned, that venture, and there was also further discussion as to reviving the chapel for use by sailors, but that didn't go ahead either. The argument was, well, they could walk to church. Kind of forgotten the reason why it had been established in the first place. Right, and eventually it was pulled down, and its disappearance was celebrated. It was regarded as an eyesore, and I think everybody was pleased that it was gone. An advert was put in for sale, and it had to be removed by whoever purchased it, which happened. Well, the picture down the bottom there is not the chapel, because you know that's a brick. I put that there as a little ironical note, I suppose, that it was only a few years after it was pulled down in 1881 that a wharf mission was built at William Street, which is out a block from where the Bethel Chapel stood. It's a really interesting story in itself, but there's not time for that today. Basically, it was established by an 18-year-old man, and it kind of ran out of puff, and it was taken over by the town mission in 1883, and then moved to Cornwall Square in 1896, where it was enlarged and used as a city mission hall. Right, from the filth of the wharf to another seedy part of town. The next section is on the St. John's mission on Wellington Street. And that looks about as far removed as you could get from a church, but there was a little chapel inside it, and it's quite an interesting story, or at least I think so. There was a kind of a revival of religious activity amongst the working classes and the poor from the 1870s, and a lot of that has to do with the arrival of the Salvation Army. Kind of gave a wake-up call to the established churches. Also Henry Reed's Christian mission. So eventually the established churches did respond to this, including the Anglican Church, which built 3 missions in the late 19th century, one at Invermay, one at Inverusk, and a mission on Wellington Street in the old hotel, and it later moved to Canning Street. So why have I put St. John's there? I've got the wrong name on there. It's St. George's. So that started as a Sunday school mission, and it developed into a church. Well, St. John's Mission opened at the Queen's, jumped ahead. St. John's Mission was established during Henry Montgomery's term as Bishop of Tasmania, and Montgomery strongly approved of social action without political radicalism. So Anglican missions operated under the Victorian ideal of assisting the deserving poor, with missions established, as I just told you, 3 places in town. this idea of deserving poor is going to come through quite strongly in some of the sources which I'm going to put out. So it opened at the Queen's Head, and it became available because it had been refused a renewal of its license due to ill-regulated business. I'm not quite sure what that means, but basically ceased operating, and an opportunity presented itself to be used as a mission, because that was a fairly seedy part of town. And that's, as far as I can work out, that's where it was located. Driving force behind the mission, it was Charlotte Shoebridge, better known as Sister Charlotte. She was the eldest daughter of Ebenezer and Charlotte Shoebridge of Bushy Park, who had made their fortune growing hops. In 1894, Sister Charlotte was ordained deaconess in the Church of England, the first deaconess in Tasmania. So that was all new to me. It's quite interesting lady, a remarkable lady, in fact. She moved up to Launceston in 1892 to take up the challenge of running the mission. In 1893, the Examiner reported on the progress made on renovations, which included converting the Skittle Alley into a chapel, which Henry Reed had done the same thing. He'd also converted a hotel down the other end of Wellington Street, and used a Skittle chapel initially before the Christian mission was built. So the little description here: the interior has been completely transformed. A number of energetic young men having volunteered to carry out the renovation without reward. Ms. Shoebridge will reside in the building and will conduct sewing classes for girls in one of the rooms during the evening. I like this bit. The work will be made very interesting in that, besides receiving instruction, the women and girls will have the pleasure of hearing the lady read from good books. So there will be a combination of instruction and amusement, and then the rider, the element of religion being, of course, always present. I don't know how good books and religion go, but anyway. And the Daily Telegraph has a brief description of the chapel, and it's a chapel in very loose terms. The old Skittle Alley has been transformed into a mission room for meetings. A platform has been erected at one end, curtains hung, and a coloured glass window put in. A little token. This is the chapel statement. Seats and a harmonium had been purchased from the YMCA rooms that would have been in the Quadrant Mall, and I think the YMCA had moved premises at that stage. The services will be evangelical. The special object of this mission work is to reach those who do not at present time attend any church. It opened on Palm Sunday, March 1883, with 60 present for the first service. The photograph there is mod of the mission. I couldn't help myself, I just love that photograph. It comes from Hobart, I think it's up in the Cascades, from memory. It's about the closest as I could get. And it's good. The reason why I put that on there is because I'm going to read you that horror. It's just a beautiful writing from the Examiner, which kind of brings the work of the mission alive. And it's about the soup kitchen. So if you'll just forgive me while I read this. So it was held up as a model of Christian charity, and it received quite a lot of prominence in the local press. So this is on the soup kitchen. I think the original article was about 2,000 words. It was a soup day at St. John's Mission when Sister Charlotte dispenses a savoury compound. A small crowd was congregated in the yard at the rear of the building. The gathering consisted for the most part of children, young boys and girls, each carrying some sort of utensil. A somewhat remarkable feature was that the smaller the child, the larger the can or jug it carried, suggesting to the writer one of two things. Either the little messenger had been provided with the largest vessel available in order to minimise the danger of the soup being spilt during transit, or that the utensil donated in some way the size of the family for whom the soup was required. As regard to the customers themselves, they were the children of the poor, but respectable, hard-working people. Sister Charlotte was busily engaged stirring a 20-gallon copper pot, a bowl of which sampled was found to be excellent. It was good, wholesome, nutritious compound of a substantial kind with plenty of body in it. not the watery, insipid, tasteless stuff, tasteless kind of stuff so frequently served up under a grand-sounding name. We do not give away the soup, explained Sister Charlotte, but make a nominal charge of 1 penny per quart for it. Our motto is to help those who help themselves, and it is along those lines St. John's mission is conducted, the deserving poor. The principle is certainly a good one, and there is no doubt that indiscriminate charity has the effect of killing the spirit of independence and self-help which prevails amongst the industrious poor. There's such a thing as pauperizing people, and this unfortunately is brought about through carelessness on the part of those who dispense charity. And I suppose that still plays out today in some ways. People give money for charity and sometimes make the matters worse. They're giving money to beggars, I suppose, and it's not used for the purpose which it's intended. I suppose that's the idea behind it. The work of the mission was extensive. Report from 1900 notes that attendance for the year was almost 13,000. And this included Sunday services, Bible readings, First Holy Communion, choir practice in the Sunday school. So it is functioning as a place of worship, as a religious institution. They have got no record of the number of people that they fed. Another article from the Daily Telegraph, Sister Charlotte was interviewed. She says, ours is preventative work, not rescue work. Now that's a dig at the Salvation Army. Okay, they were into rescue work. And there was a bit of tension between the established churches and the Salvation Army. One of the features of our work is teaching girls to sew and cut out. They pay a penny per night, and we provide the material. The garment becomes their property. We inculcate into girls a knowledge of the methods of housework and housekeeping. Also, making the small charge mentioned, it would be quite a mistake to do it all for nothing. What is not paid for is not valued. No, there's a second part of the story, and I'm not going to say too much about that. I'd rather move on, you get the idea, but essentially the mission moved to Canning Street in 1906, new mission hall. That's now the Launceston Backpackers. And the hall in that building was later called the Shoebridge Hall. And a chapel was planned, but never built. And if you look at the unfinished brickwork on the edge there, I believe that's where it was supposed to join onto the mission, a separate chapel. So Sister Charlotte continued to work at Canning Street until 1910, till the age of 67, where she returned to Hobart, spending her last days at Kingston Beach, where she died in 1925. The Queen's Head Mission was acquired by the Launceston City Mission in 1910 and used as a home for men until 1935. I'm not sure, I don't know what happened to it after that. The photograph that comes from the All Saints Network, Launceston, I just love the little caption that was written, it must be on the back at the bottom of the photograph, to live in the hearts we leave behind is not to die. And I'm sure she would have left part of herself in the hearts of a lot of those children and people living in that part of town. Got no idea how we're going for time. Just start waving at me if you need me to speak faster. The next and the last stop, or substantial stop, is the Launceston's Chinese missions, which run between 1884 and 1902. And just start with, I think I might have, right, I'll go back. Right, so this is again not a traditional church by any means, but it's nevertheless very interesting. Up until the 1870s, Tasmania's Chinese population was minuscule. With the discovery of tin in the northeast, there followed an influx of Chinese miners who soon dominated small-scale alluvial mines. When many European miners left the tin fields in the 1880s in response to falling tin prices, Chinese miners were able to make a living from the abandoned workings. Chinese miners were generally better treated than on the mainland diggings and were respected as hardworking and law-abiding citizens. Launceston was also the home, as I said, to a small Chinese community. Most of them were engaged in retail business and in market gardening. In 1882, a Chinese branch of the town mission was established, and this operated out of the YMCA rooms in the quadrant. And there's a fair bit of information about this, and there's just one I've taken out, and that's an 1883 meeting led by the missionary, Mr. Marshall, and we're told that it attracted 43 Chinese and their families, and addresses were given by David R. Ching, James Chin Kit, and R. Cat, and a Chinese branch of the Blue Ribbon Army was formed in the crusade against the use of strong drinks and opium. Many of Launceston's Chinese inhabitants converted to Christianity, most of whom became associated with the Memorial Church and also the Patterson Street Methodist Church, and I'll talk about that at the end. The main thing which I want to focus on is the mission, which was based in Launceston and was aimed at the Chinese miners on the tin fields. This was established in 1884, and it was an interdenominational mission whose purpose was to evangelize the Chinese, notably the tin miners. For most of the 10 years in which the first mission was active, it was led by missionary Bartholomew Wang Pu. A lot of information about him. I'll just give you a little bit today. So it was established in the Mechanics Institute, which was a place where actually a lot of religious activity took place. A lot of smaller groups met there, and the familiar faces were there, as always, Price, Mr. Marshall, and Mr. Law. In setting this up, a committee was formed, and by mid-1885, Reverend Bartholomew Wang Pu was appointed missionary. Mr. Slide there, that's, got ahead of myself, that's Marina. So that's where he was formed, based. The Examiner announced Wang Pu's arrival on the SS Flinders in July 1885, and he was met by Reverend Hayward, Secretary of the Mission, as well as a deputation of Chinese brethren. The Examiner noted, Reverend Wang Pu has been labouring in Sandhurst, Victoria, and more recently in Hay, New South Wales, and in both places his labours have borne good fruit. Mrs. Wang Pu, who is a Scots lady, will accompany her husband. So shortly after, he moves to Marina, which is the committee considered to be the most central place for him to reside, and he was to provide a monthly report to the mission secretary, and he was paid £120 annually with travel expenses added. Shortly after he arrived, he actually gave an address to the committee, brief report on his work, and that was held in the Wesleyan Schoolroom on Patterson Street. Mr. Wang Pu addressed the meeting at some length, referring to the universal kindness received from English and Chinese alike, and gave an interesting account of his work amongst the countrymen, their desire for the Bible and an eagerness to hear the gospel. Now, there was a second take on this meeting, and this comes from the Hobart Mercury, and I've put that in there. It just shows you how reliable or unreliable sources are, a completely different take. Mr. Wang Pu gave his experiences, which were delivered in very broken English and in a tone that was inaudible to all except those near the platform, and were not very entertaining to the major portion of the audience. The Chinese, noticing this after consulting amongst themselves and arriving at the conclusion that Wang Pu's time was up, started applauding him so determinedly he sat down. And at this point I can say I'm very glad that people are not breaking to applause, otherwise I'd get the message. So much of the information about this mission comes from an annual report which was put into the local press. They're quite interesting and lengthy, and I've just put a few snippets in there. So he was quite successful in arriving at Marina in August. So a month after he arrived, he held a service in Welborough with 73 persons in attendance, followed by one at Garibaldi with 105 in attendance. No, I'm cutting that bit out. After the 1891 meeting, Mr. Wang Pu described the havoc wrought by the opium curse in the district, which was most startling and most painful. I'm paraphrasing here. He affirms that many Europeans are also falling into the same ruinous habits. And then Reverend Law, we met earlier, I just found this comment interesting. He says, the Chinese in our midst were industrious, thrifty, sober, and law-abiding, and it was the duty of the mission to teach them the gospel. And this is the interesting bit, but it was a harder task to commend Christianity by the example of our daily lives. That's probably very close to the truth. The mission's annual reports reveal that while Wang Pu was respected amongst the Chinese miners, the number of conversions were low. In 1892, Wang Pu became a citizen of the colony following his application for naturalization, and in the following year he resigned as missioner at the age of 52. Little else is known about him apart from a handful of references in the press. For example, in 1893, the Committee of the Launceston City and Suburbs Improvement Association recorded its thanks for a donation of plants for beautifying the Cataract Cliff grounds. And to quote from the Examiner, he, Wang Pu, I need to go back, I've lost myself. He, Wang Pu, presented the Improvement Association with about 50 Boronia plants reared by him at Marina, where we understood he has gained no little celebrity as a successful grower of this graceful and sweet-smelling shrub. The last trace I found of him is at Turners Marsh, where there's a report of him lending his paddock for use for a Sunday school picnic for the Turners Marsh Methodist Church. I'll go back, I'll put a lid on that one. Russell Wang Pu's departure from the mission effectively ended its work. However, the Anglican Church was to briefly take up the challenge previously carried out by the nonconformists. In 1894, Reverend Young Chow was appointed Anglican catechist, and in 1895, at a public meeting chaired by Bishop Montgomery, an account of the new missions progress was given. Mr. Yang Choi, who spoke in Chinese, Mr. Chin Kit, acting as interpreter, explained that the population was very much scattered. Last Sunday, he preached to 75 Chinamen at Garibaldi, and on one occasion spoke to 60 at Branxholme. The work of conveying the gospel to the Chinese in the colony is an important one. One Chinaman has been baptized at Garibaldi, and he gave lessons every evening to others. Some of the Chinese in Garibaldi district were married, and their children were being taught Christianity. In the next year of the meeting, an extract from that, the mission made a decision that he should concentrate his efforts at Garibaldi, which is recognized as their chief center. The camp at Garibaldi contained some 120 Chinese, of whom 4 were Christians. There were 6 half-caste families with 32 children in all of whom 6 were Roman Catholics and the remainder belonged to the Church of England. It was estimated that in addition to these, some 50 Chinamen visited Garibaldi on Sundays. The evangelist was one who showed much zeal in his work, and he was assisted by Li Parling, a native doctor and a man of influence, a baptized member of the church. Okay, so same as Wang Pu, there is interest, but I think there were also benefits in terms of being taught to read and write and so on, which attracted people. Now, Young Choi's mission was short-lived, partly due to the funding needed to sustain it. Quite a sad departure, I think. In April 1886, the Examiner reported his departure. Young Choi has left his field of work, but he's still in Launceston, staying with a friend till their diocese can pay what is due to him, so that he in turn may pay his debts. About £15 is wanted still. So he was left at a loose end. A third Chinese mission was established under the Methodists, under Yi Kit, and I know very little about this. I haven't done much work on it. And he set out based in Launceston, and works in Branxholme, Derby, Marina, and so on, and supported by the local Chinese community. But I haven't done much work on that at this point. I would guess it didn't last very long at all, given the decline in mining in that area and also the Commonwealth government's restrictions on immigration. And now, just to finish, how are we going for time? Oh, Amongst Launceston's Chinese community, the Memorial Church was a significant place of worship, and it was here that English reading and writing was taught in the church schoolroom, for which the Chinese community was incredibly grateful. There's lots of reports of the Chinese community thanking the local community for the work which they did for them. So there's two quotes here. I'll just read both of them. I just like them. Part of the proceeding, this is 1893 tea meeting. Part of the proceeding was the presentation to Mrs. Sultan of an album which contained the signatures of all the donors, both in Chinese and English characters. The frontispiece was adorned with a watercolour drawing of the Cataract Gorge by the son of worthy Chinese interpreter Mr. Chin Kit. The presentation was made with Mr. J.T. Famillo, who has shown an active interest in the welfare of the Chinese in the city and presides over their Sunday services classes for them. And Famillo built the Albert Hall. Anyway, so he was quite a prominent member of the town and very active in the Memorial Church. In the following year, the Chinese again showed their appreciation of the efforts of their instructors and gave a tea meeting in the schoolroom. About 200 invitations were issued and accepted. 60 Chinese were present and took part in the proceedings. The room was very prettily decorated, and the feature being an ornamental arch at the desk surmounted by Chinese lanterns and the word "God is love." I don't know that picture, I can see that. Classes and meetings were held in what was known as the Chinese vestry, and the work which the church does is probably the reason why so many converted to Christianity and continued to support the church. This is evident in 1943, a birthday function held to honour Mr. James Chang-gong, the Chinese patriarch, who had a long association with the Memorial Church, and I'll just read you the quote. The function was held at the Launceston Baptist Memorial Church, become Baptist by this stage, last night in honour of Mr. Chang-gong, who's been associated with the church for 66 years. Patriarch of the Chinese community, Mr. Chang-gong, celebrated his 88th birthday. During the period, he's been in Launceston for nearly 70 years. He's earned the highest respect from everyone for his honesty, business and benevolence. Last night's function was arranged by the Memorial Church Choir and the Christian Endeavour and Women's Auxiliary. Mr. Chang-gong became a Christian and was connected with the church when Chinese classes and meetings were held in the Chinese vestry. Right, so I've almost finished on time. When Marion asked me for some material, I gave her some random pictures, and I thought, oh gosh, I'm not going to actually speak about those, and I hope nobody's actually pitched up to expecting a talk on some of these. So I'll just briefly say a couple about these, couple of buildings which appeared in the promotional material. The one is the Galvin Street Salvation Army Hall. It was erected in 1922. That picture was on the Society's Facebook page. So that was replaced in 1942 by the building on the right-hand side, which still stands there. The building came from Deloraine. There's a photograph of it in Deloraine. It was moved here and stood till 42. Then it was moved behind the new building where it was used as a band room and a youth room. And at some point it was demolished. I've got so much material on the Salvation Army. It is really interesting, and I had toyed with the idea of doing something today, but you need a lot of context for that, so I decided I wouldn't go down that path. I'd do the ones which I've done instead. Now, I was going to do this one as well, and then I had a bit of a crisis of confidence. I think I misidentified a building, so I just pulled it. So hopefully here somebody might know something which might help me here. So this is the Ravenswood churches. Now Ravenswood is a bit of a black hole in terms of history. There's just so little information available, and it's actually quite hard to work out what went on there, but there were a large number of churches there: Baptist Mission, Gospel Hall, the Christian Mission, Methodist Church, Anglicans came in as well late, and the Catholics, and there's still a number of churches running there today. Religion is thriving. And the story of these churches is really fascinating because there's a bit of controversy behind them. So the one on the right, I'm fairly confident in saying that is the Wesleyan Church or the Methodist Church that stands on the corner of Wildor Crescent and Henry Street. That's where the little chapel is. I can't work out where the Gospel Hall was. No, the picture from the Weekly Courier, it states that it's Ravens Church and School, so you can identify the Methodist Church on the corner there. The cemetery is close to it, and across the way is the school. Now, I've got a funny feeling that the school was the church, or a church, because I can't trace much from the education department. But the school was moved to Ogilvy Park in 1940 as a residence. And I think the Gospel Hall was actually the mission hall which stood behind the school. That's as far as I've got. There's very few gone on to list maps and land ownership. There's nothing there. Found something from the 50s which shows the position of two churches. It appears that the one church stands fairly back off the road. I've got all the history there, but it's a bit embarrassing because you can't actually be sure you're talking about the right building from the photographs. So if anybody knows something about that, I'd be very grateful for that. Right, that's it, I'm done. Should I say any questions?
Any questions?
I'm all talked out, so I'm quite relieved. Anything you'd like to ask? I hope I didn't disappoint. I don't know what people expected. I tried to bring something which was different, which no people like the familiar. And there's so many stories, and 170 churches, 170 stories, and just the people and the communities which make up the stories of these churches, and not just buildings. I started off with just looking at buildings because they're such a critical part in the life of people way back when. It's amazing how history is written without them. You can't really understand a community without its churches. And the individuals involved in these stories, particularly the women, come through very, very strongly. So it's fascinating material. So just to remind you, you can follow up on the website. I'm a little bit embarrassed. The first 100 I wrote were a bit amateurish. I started with Launceston. I was still honing my skills there, so you might be a bit disappointed with some of the material. I'm going to go back and rewrite them. I still have about 400 to complete in the state, mainly down south and on the east coast. So once those are done, I'll come back to Launceston and do a better job of the earlier ones.
Are there any churches you want us to keep an eye out for that you can't find?
You know, I'm trying to think. There would be quite a few. I mean, I'll have to think about it. Nobody's found a photograph of St. Joseph's, for example, and the campers were operating around there. That's Church of the Apostles. You know, off my head, I can't think. I'm just collecting as many as I can. There are things which actually pop out of nowhere, which people have said to me, and I hope to pass it on to the State Library or something at some point, so that they're preserved, otherwise they're just going to disappear. Mm-hmm.
Can I just ask, have you done some work on Jewish tabernacles and other buildings in Launceston?
Yes, I've got material on the Launceston Tabernacle, that's that Launceston Synagogue, and that will be, I want to get inside. I would really like, because it's not it's an attractive building, but it's a difficult one to photograph. I have been inside. It's very interesting inside. So I'm kind of waiting for an opportunity to get in before I put that up, as well as the Hobart Synagogue. It's a fascinating story. Also, there are mosques. There's one in Hobart, and there's one that's just opened up in Kings Meadows, which really was originally a Baptist church in the 50s. It was built in an old factory. Not quite sure what they produced in the factory, hopefully not alcohol, but it was a factory, it became a Baptist church, and then after that, the Salvation Army, and now it's a mosque. And of course, the Buddhist group in Invermay as well, that's on the list.
That factory was a meat factory.
Oh, this is a meat factory. Oh,
Yeah.
there we go.
I used to go to that church as in the 1950s.
Oh, fantastic.
And over the back, the kiddies used to run around and play around in the ruins of the meat factory.
Yes.
There's a question about a church up near Peyton and Bournes there.
Yes.
It's not there anymore. It's like a park now. Is there any photos or anything of that particular church? That's it runs in a little road between. It's above the factory. It runs across a small road. It's a lane, actually.
Yeah, I don't know that one.
Right. Rose Lane.
Oh,
yeah,
Rose Lane.
that's it,
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. That is. I know that one is now a dance school. It's still there, I think.
No. This one's a ruin. There's nothing there. It's just a park. Where
No, I don't know that one.
the Peyton's Bowls Club
Yes,
is.
yes. Oh, Peyton's Bowls Club. I'm
Yes,
looking at the factory.
that's it. Was
Yep.
virtually on the
Yep.
ground
Yes.
of what was a church, a
Oh.
fairly substantial church by the look of it. But
Oh, where the cemetery is.
Yeah.
Well, that's new to me. I'll have to follow that up.
yes, I think so. Yeah.
Could it have been a funeral chapel, perhaps?
No, I think it was a church.
Yes. Okay, and I'll follow that up. Thanks for that. That's completely new to me. So it was in the vicinity of Rose Lane.
Yes, there's a Scottish church now. Well, it was a Scottish church
Yes.
down below. A
Right.
new one.
Yes.
It just was up the back of that.
Oh, right. Okay, I think I know where you are now. Yeah. No, I've worked out where the area is. No, I don't know that. I'll have to look it up. Thanks for that, and thanks for the butchery, the butcher's factory too. I tried to look it up, but I couldn't find it.
It was like a slaughterhouse.
Yes.
Fairly big.
Yes.
A fairly big establishment.
Yes.
It was there before Kings Meadows was
Right.
actually around. There was a laneway that
Yes.
ran off the main road,
Yes.
went right up the back fence where the school is,
Yes.
and then crossed over, and it was fairly like a big shed, massive shed. There was a lot of machinery in it, which ended up in the bush where
Yes.
the new subdivision is now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for that. I'll make a note of that, because this information just goes. Once people forget, that's it. It's lost. So I'll make a note of that today. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Mary.
Thank you very much for coming today, Duncan. And speaking about those churches, there were some fascinating photos there, especially those ones you put up at the beginning.
Yes.
Some I've never seen before, and those ones, the Ravenswood ones, are a bit of a mystery too. So,
I need to work that
yes.
out. I was going to go with it, and I just thought, no, I'm going to make a mistake here somewhere. So I need to. It's so hard. The material's very, very limited, and I've even tried local knowledge, and people just don't remember. So.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and
Thank
here's
you.
a little gift.
Thank you very
for
much.
coming along today. Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming today, and we'll see you all again next month for our last meeting of the year. I think it's the 20th of November. Yep, and that'll be back in the other room, in the meeting room, as usual. Thank you so much for coming.